Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's 30 Minutes program. I really have a treat for you today, and this happens to be Mike McWherter. He is the son of the late Governor Ned McWherter, and we're going to be talking about 40 years ago when Governor McWherter was inaugurated to be governor of Tennessee. And, Mike, it's a great pleasure to have you here on the radio, but more importantly to know that you are a lot like your dad.
Well, Paul, thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I'm always happy to be back in Weakley County. So thanks for having me.
What was it like growing up with your dad?
It was really pretty wonderful. He was a good dad. He was really, a lot of politicians, I think, struggle with balancing, their business and their family and political life, or public life, I should say. And, but my father, I think, did a really good job. Now, he had a whole lot of help from his mother and his father, and who were very important in our family and a big part of it. But it was interesting growing up with Ned McWherter. He was very entertaining, and he was a lot of fun. If you want to know the truth about it, my grandmother didn't have much of a sense of humor. My grandfather had a whole lot of a sense of humor, and I think Dad got both qualities. He got my grandmother's work ethic, and he got my grandfather's sense of humor.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about your grandmother and her name and your grandfather's name.
Lucille McWherter ran the City Cafe over in Dresden, Tennessee. It got taken out by the tornado. When the tornado went through Dresden, the building did. She had quit much longer before that. She ran it for 35 years over there. Got up every morning before 5 o'clock, was downtown, getting the griddle hot so she could start serving breakfast at 5:30 and work till 8 o'clock every night. My grandfather was around, but she did that for 35 years, fed everybody, I think, that came through Dresden, and certainly all of the courthouse crowd. And I really think she was kind of the root of Dad's popularity when he first ran for state representative, because he ran unopposed. And it was kind of like, if you want someplace to eat in Dresden, you better not oppose Miss Lucille's husband.
Tell me about your mom. She went early.
My mother died she died in 1973. I was 17. She suffered with breast cancer. And in those days, she was diagnosed in 68. And in those days, they removed the breast and gave you some chemotherapy and hope for the best. And she got really about 4.5 years out of it, and then really suffered quite a bit towards the end. And it was hard seeing her go, is the bottom line. But she passed away in 1973.
What did she leave you? And I'm not talking about things that you hold in your hand. I'm talking about advice and those things.
I always knew that my mother loved me dearly, and that was enough, Paul. She had a nickname of being Big-Hearted Betty. And that was sort of given to her by her family, because she would literally give you the shirt off of her back if a friend asked for it. And so that was kind of her nickname. And I really didn't know that until some years after she had passed away. But she was just, I just always knew my mother, loved me dearly. And that is the best thing that you can ever have, is to have loving parents, I think.
You grew up stage, Union City. What was your relationship to Union City in Obion County?
Well, my parents separated when I was about 4, and my mother was from Union City, and so she moved back what she considered to be home. And my father, who was living in Union City at the time, moved back to Dresden because that was his home. And so I was really kind of between both communities, 22 miles apart, and spent a lot of time in Dresden and a lot of time in Union City. But I actually, went to school in Union City from elementary school all the way through high school.
Class of 73, 74?
Class of 74, mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was the second class to graduate from the high school in Union City. The class of 73 was the first class to graduate. from that high school building, but I was the second. And it still looks new to me, but I know it's now like 40 years old, which went back in those days when I was 18, 40 years sounded like an old building.
Did you know where you were going to go after you graduated high school? What you were going to do?
Really no clue about what I wanted to do. I had a teacher in Martin, Mrs. Bigham. Her son, I believe, his name was Martin, and I believe for a while he was an undertaker here in Martin, Tennessee. Mrs. Bigham was my 8th grade history teacher in Union City, but she was from Martin, and she always told me I needed to be a lawyer. And she was convinced that was my calling in life. And so when I graduated from high school, I looked at UT, and, back in those days, UT was about 40,000 students. And that was just way too big for me coming from Dresden, Union City. I looked at a couple other schools, looked at Swanee, thought about UT Martin, but I really and truly, while I loved UT Martin and a lot of my friends were going there, I felt like I needed to go somewhere else. And the only school I didn't really visit was Vanderbilt. And I could find fault in every other school I looked at. So I decided if I went and visited Vanderbilt, I probably wouldn't like it either. And I wasn't sure what I would do. And so by process of elimination, I decided to go to Vanderbilt. So that's really how I wound up at Vanderbilt. It's the one campus I didn't visit, and could not find it. Because of that, I couldn't find anything wrong with it. Stayed there 4 years. Really went and thought I would probably transfer to UT Knoxville after I got a little more used to college life. But I wound up staying 4 years, and then I wound up going to law school there and did become a lawyer and fulfilled what Mrs. Bigham thought I ought to do. She was a great teacher.
Well, the thing that I wonder, how much time did you get a chance to see with your dad and going to college in Nashville? And was he in politics at that time?
Well, I went off to college in the fall of 75, and you hit the nail on the head. I think that was the other subconscious reason. My mother had died my junior year in high school, and I was embarking on totally new territory in life. And knowing that my dad was going to be around in Nashville and he was going to be up there half the year, and be in Dresden half the year, going to Vanderbilt made a lot of sense because that way I could be around and a lot closer to him. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it gave me a sense of security. I was away at school, but at the same time, my father wasn't far away.
If you just joined us, we're talking with Mike McWherter. He is the son of the late Ned Ray McWherter, whose inauguration is coming up here. It's hard to believe, 40 years. First inauguration, and then the second, of course, came a little bit later on. I want to ask a couple of easy questions, and that is, were you pretty close to your dad during that time? Because sometimes when you're in law school or he's in law handling the state of Tennessee, did y'all get to see a lot of each other?
Actually, we did. And I guess that was more me. Dad didn't exactly call me up and say, hey, you want to go to dinner tonight or whatever. He did occasionally. But it was more me looking for a free meal. And so I would call him and say, hey, I know y'all got through today. Are you sticking around town? And then he'd say, yeah, well, you want to go eat? So I probably saw him at least, once a week, while I was in college, of the months that he was up there in the legislature. There was a time, Paul, when literally I knew all 99 legislators because I'd be up there pretty frequently, and I could go sit behind the podium where Dad was the Speaker of the House and wait on him to go to dinner. But gosh, now there's been so much turnover. I barely know who any of the state reps are or the state senators. But back in the day when I was in college, I knew a lot of them personally and counted many of them in a bipartisan fashion as friends of mine.
Was your dad tough?
Determined, I would think, would be a better way of saying it. No, I don't really think he was tough. Dad was was a very empathetic man. He understood people, and he understood the struggles that they faced in day-to-day life. And that's one of the things I think he really enjoyed about public service was he felt like he was making a difference for people in their lives. I know that's right. And he's a very empathetic person.
Was he the kind of guy that was focused, say, running for an office, which he did many times, and then a big office, and then he said, I'm not doing this anymore? So
absolutely. When he was done, and he really wanted to be governor. Now this is a true story about his career. I kind of pieced this together from comments that people have told me over the years. When he was in high school, he thought he wanted to be in the highway patrol. That was his ambition. And then as time went on and he got elected to the legislature, at the urging of a lot of people around Dresden to run for it, he kind of had his sights set on the idea of being the Tennessee Secretary of State. There was a longtime gentleman named Joe Carr who had been the Secretary of State for years, and he was nearing retirement age, and I think Dad set his sights on doing that. A guy named Jim McKinney got elected Speaker in 1970, and he was very contentious with then Governor Winfield Dunn, who was the first Republican governor elected in 50 years. And they sort of had a ongoing feud. And a lot of people in the legislature were unhappy about that. They felt like, you should be supportive of the governor no matter who he is. And if the governor's successful, the state will be successful. And so there was kind of a rebellion in the House about Speaker McKinney's leadership. And they started looking towards Ned McWherter to challenge him.
This is after his first term?
No, this is before his first term. This is when he's deciding to run in 72. And so he decided that he would stand for running as Speaker of the House, which was totally different from his thought process about eventually running as Secretary of State, Tennessee Secretary of State. So he ran and he won in the caucus by one vote, 26-25 in the Democratic caucus. And then he went on to win the election as Speaker 50-49. So one vote in the caucus, one vote in the House got him elected Speaker of the House. And he went on from there to have an incredibly successful 14 years as Speaker of the House.
People that know the name Casey Pentecost is associated with the McWherter family. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, absolutely. The Casey Pentecost you're referring to is a public service commissioner and was a cousin of my father's. And just a great, they were almost like brothers, if you want to know the truth about it. But Casey actually will always hold the distinction of serving in statewide office longer than anybody in Tennessee history, because as the Public Service Commission, he served a 6-year term, and he served 4 6-year terms, 24 years. Well, there is nobody else in state office. Now, you might have a United States Senator in federal office, but as far as state offices go, the governor's term limited, and nobody else has ever served for 24 years in statewide elective office except for Casey Pentecost. And they were like Dad, like brothers. Casey was the Public Service Commissioner while Dad was Speaker, and they were extremely close. Casey's father, who was the county judge in Weakley County, and I am really going back several years now, Casey's father was a big mentor to my father in helping to launch his political career. And he was apparently pretty much of a force in Weakley County back in the day. He ran his son, young Casey, for the state house before my father was there. And I believe this would be back in the 1940s, and got him elected while he was still serving in World War II and was still in Europe. But he got him elected to the state house as the state representative, knowing that he was coming home and the war was over with, but his son was still actually serving in the military in Europe at the time.
You have graduated from Vanderbilt, let's say now, move forward. What happened? When did you go to that first inauguration?
Well, it was 1986. I was 30 years old. And actually, I guess it was really January of 1987. He got elected in 86. The inauguration was 87. And it was a few days before I turned 31. I have a birthday in January. So I was 30 years old. We were at the inauguration. It was a bitterly cold day. My grandmother was still living. My grandfather had passed away at that point in time. My grandmother was there. My sister, Linda Ramsey, who's from here in Martin, of course, was there, and all of the family was there. So this very special time, and so glad that my grandmother was able to live long enough to see her son sworn in as governor. It's pretty amazing. When you think about, she lived through the dad was born during the Depression, and my grandparents lived through the Depression. And I remember my grandmother talking about the fact that they had absolutely no money at all, but they didn't really think much about it because nobody had any money during the Depression. So they were like just everybody else. But to see her son reach that level in life had to be just totally beyond her imagination.
Was your dad involved with volunteer trucks and volunteer distributing? Was he in that part of the business at that time when he went into the?
Very much so. Yeah. Dad was quite an entrepreneur. And he got involved in a trucking company early on called Wharton, with a gentleman from Dresden named Jimmy Wharton. And from there, he got involved in the shoe business in Martin, Tennessee, and right across from basically where Cadillac's is, I guess you call it a bar, and the building has since been torn down. But he had a shoe factory over there where he made baby shoes, and he ran that for a long time. Basically, he said that as the Japanese moved into his market, he had to start moving towards the Caribbean to sell his shoes to parochial schools, which he did. So he traveled quite a bit throughout the Caribbean. And then anyway, from there, he got a chance to buy a volunteer distributing company. I don't think it was called that. He named it that in those days. And it was located in Martin. He relocated it to Dresden, and then subsequent to that, he started Volunteer Express, which is a truck company that eventually grew to a point it was located in Nashville. We had a terminal in Dresden, but the headquarters was in Nashville. And of course, he was involved in helping to develop a nursing home in Dresden, along with Casey Pentecost, his dear friend, and Eddie Ellis in those days. So, and Dad was involved. He was an investor in the Bank of Gleason and Bank of Weakley County, and a shareholder in the People's Bank. He was always one lesson he always told me was to I guess it's the word delayed gratification. He would say, Mike, delayed gratification. You don't need to live up your assets. You need to always be investing for the future. And I've tried to impart that to my own children.
If you've just joined us, we're talking with Mike McWherter. He is the son of the late Ned McWherter. We're coming up on 40 years of the inauguration. Let me ask you, did you live in the big house there the one that he was living in. And we're talking about this because I've got a question or two about it. I'm going to want to know. Did you go to the mansion?
I was going to say, are you referring to his home in Dresden or to the governor's residence?
Yeah.
You know, I'm not really poking fun. I'm not meaning to make this a political statement, but normally when the Republicans are in, they refer to it as the governor's mansion.
Okay.
When the Democrats are in, it's referred to as the governor's residence. So yes, I was at the governor's residence. My grandmother was suffering from cancer right after Dad got elected governor, and she was taking a lot of treatments in Nashville. Oddly enough, the next door neighbor was a lady named Miss Henry Cannon, who I had done some legal work for as a lawyer in Nashville in those days. Mrs. Cannon is better known as Minnie Pearl, and Mrs. Cannon, Minnie Pearl, had undergone cancer treatments as well, and she was quite a comfort to my grandmother in her later days. So my grandmother was there in Nashville quite a bit in those first several months of Dad's administration. They were doing a lot of renovation at the governor's residence upstairs, and I stayed out there with her. Dad was not living in the governor's residence at that point in time because they were rewiring and replumbing and doing the renovations. The home was several decades old when Dad took over. And Lamar Alexander had been living there before my father, and Lamar had a lot of young children. And when you went upstairs, and I mean this respectfully, but the bedrooms kind of looked like a dormitory. And they should, because there were a bunch of kids living up there. And so when Dad moved in, he raised quite a bit of private funds to fund renovating the upstairs bedrooms. And I think he left the residence really looking a lot nicer than he found it. But they were doing quite a bit of work up there. So I stayed out there with my grandmother quite a bit while she was there, so she would not be there and be alone. Dad was a frequenter there. He used the governor's residence at that time for meeting with a lot of the legislators. So he was in and out during the day. He just wasn't there at night, and I would stay at night and be out there with my grandmother.
And Miss Minnie Pearl was at the side of your mother many hours.
My grandmother.
Your grandmother.
Yeah, she was a tremendously kind-hearted woman and very kind to my grandmother, and became a very good friend of my grandmother.
Mm-hmm. By the way,
I have a great story on Minnie Pearl and Henry.
Let's hear it.
As I said, I did a little bit of legal work for him. Her husband's name was Henry. And so one day, the tour buses would come by the governor's residence and also stop in front, but they wouldn't let them stop in front of the governor's residence for security reasons. So they would stop in front of the Cannon's home, Minnie Pearl's home. And they weren't supposed to let the tourists out. But on this particularly pretty day, they decided they would let them get out to take some pictures. And Henry was downstairs. Somebody had given his wife, at one of her appearances, a dogwood tree. And he'd gone down by the gate to their residence to plant this dogwood tree. And he was in overalls and a work shirt. And one of the tourists walked over to him and said, "Do you work here?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, is this where Minnie Pearl lives?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Well, how long have you worked for Minnie Pearl?" And he said, "Well, I've worked for her most of my life, most of my adult life, but certainly I've worked for her ever since we've lived here." And apparently the stewardess was pretty nosy and said, "Well, does she pay you well?" And apparently Henry looked at her and said, "No, but if I do a good job, she lets me sleep with her." They said the tourists jumped back in the bus and they took off.
Oh my goodness. That's a classic.
Yes. And Henry was a classic. He was like my grandfather. He was quite a character, and he had a great sense of humor. By the way, Henry was a pilot, and he flew Hank Williams Sr. and a bunch of the old Opry people. I think that's how he met Minnie Pearl. It was flying a lot of these people around in those days.
We have just a few moments. One of the most, I think, was the most difficult time, two times, I think, in my lifetime of being around your dad, Governor Ned McWherter. And one of those, and he told me this, the darkest night of his life was when the bridge fell apart down on Highway 51. Yes. And all of those people passed away. I remember that. And the second time that I saw your father in such a very, very tough situation, losing his mama.
Yeah, I don't doubt that he shared that those were two really traumatic nights for him. There's no question about it. I've driven over that bridge many times driving from down to Memphis, Tennessee, and I just can't imagine the people who were driving on the bridge that night in the dark. There were no lights on that bridge, and then just suddenly winding up in the Hatchie Bottom River, and just disappearing, their lives just disappearing. And anybody who would be driving down that bridge and would think about that would understand how traumatic and frightening that had to be, and tough on the families that were involved, and knowing that that's how their loved ones had been taken away. And then my grandmother's death, she was my father's anchor. There's no question about it. And so with her passing, he told me one time she passed away in, right around Easter of 1987. And he said he woke up one Sunday morning in September, and he was at the governor's residence. He had moved in by that point in time. And he said, I just realized I could really never go home again because my mother was not there. And I think mothers do represent home to so many of us. And when we lose our mother, we sort of lose there's just a part of us that we all lose. And it hit him finally. He'd been so busy with the legislature being in session, and then, being a first year governor and trying to, get his programs in place. And then I think by about September, it hit him that his mother was no longer there. So yeah, I don't doubt that he said that was one of the darkest days of his life.
That's going to wrap up our program here today. But here's what we're going to do, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get Mike back in here. We're going to be talking with him again because we've only covered just a portion of your dad, former Governor Ned McWherter. And the one thing I think about you, Mike, is that you have some really, really not only good stories, but got to see how things got done when it needed to be done. And I know you're on the sidelines from time to time watching what happens and so forth, but it's not anything other than the fact that you are your father's son. And when I say that, I'm thinking to myself, Mike McWherter, you probably had more influence on your father than anybody else, including your grandmother. And I see that with your heart and listening to you talking about your dad here today. But I'll give you the last word here.
Well, thank you. I do have some great stories about my father. And if you're kind enough to have me back, I'd love to share one about Brushy Mountain State Prison and Ned McWherter.
We'll find out more about that.
All right.
In our next visit. I hope you've enjoyed our program today. Mike McWherter, who, by the way, was a candidate for governor, and we will talk about that here before too long. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this week's 30 Minutes program with Mike McWherter, Paul Tinkle. So long, everybody.
You've been listening to 30 Minutes, a community affairs program on Thunderbolt Radio. You can listen to this broadcast and others anytime by visiting thunderboltradio.com and following the Thunderbolt Radio and Digital YouTube page. Thanks for listening.